Jung says, it's a matter of astronomical fact that the spring point entered the second fish, about the 16th century, the time of the Reformation and the Renaissance. And with these, there comes that spirit which culminates in the modern age. That's the spirit of Antichrist. Now, it's very interesting that precisely at this time, let's say 1500 AD, the legend of Faust arose. This legend belongs to the same symbolism as that of Antichrist. According to this legend, Dr. Faustus, a very learned physician, became bored with his empty life, and he invokes and communicates with the devil and sells his soul to the devil in return for magical knowledge, pleasure, and power. And among other things, he's granted the power to evoke the figures of Greek mythology, including Helen of Troy, so that the devil permits him to have Helen of Troy as his paramour. And then finally, after a certain period of time, like his cousin Don Juan, Faust must pay the piper, and he's dragged into hell by the devil. That's the basic story. It's quite remarkable. During the past 500 years, that story has been told again and again and again in poetry, prose, and music. One scholar has written a book describing in detail 50 different versions of Faust. And there are a lot more than that even. There was a historical Faust. It's not just a legend. And he lived from approximately 1480 to 1540. Not much is known about him, but there's definite historical evidence that he lived. He was a personal acquaintance of the Protestant reformer Melanchthon, who we are informed believed in the reality of his powers. He is said to have died during a demonstration of flying, which he was putting on for a royal audience. Very shortly after his death, legendary material so quickly obscured his biography that, as with Christ, we can't see much of the historical Faust, and all we have is the legend. But I think it's highly significant for understanding this myth that the historical Faust was a contemporary of the following people: Martin Luther, the reformer; Leonardo da Vinci, the greatest artist of the Renaissance; Paracelsus, the great alchemist, apothecary physician; Columbus, who discovered America; Erasmus, the great humanist scholar, who was the first that made the New Testament available in Greek; Copernicus, the discoverer of the Copernican view of the solar system; Vesalius, the great human anatomist; and Machiavelli, the pioneer of objective statecraft. All of these are contemporaries of Dr. John Faustus, and hence all of them partake in one way or another of the Faust legend, you see. Because what we can say now, looking back, to the 16th century, we can see that what happened then is that the God image fell out of heaven into the human psyche. In the course of that fall, out of its metaphysical status to the status of human psychological experience, in the course of that movement from heaven to earth, the God image undergoes an enantiodromia. It turns from Christ to Antichrist. It turns from Christ to Faust, so to speak. And this course of events was predicted long ago in the book of Revelation, where we read in the 12th chapter, in the 12th verse, "Woe to the inhabitants of the earth and of the sea, for the devil is come down unto you, having great wrath, because he knoweth that he hath but a short time." From the standpoint of Jungian psychology, this is what happened in the 16th century. Now, let me summarize for you my historical observations to this point. About 1500 AD, the God image fell out of heaven into the human psyche. In other words, it was withdrawn from metaphysical projection and became available for direct conscious experience. This event had a twofold effect. On one hand, it greatly increased available energy to the individual ego, promoting investigation of previously forbidden areas. But on the other hand, it had the delayed effect of alienating the ego from its transpersonal connection, from its sense of having divine guidance. And this then led to the progressive realization that man is an orphan in a meaningless universe. This double effect, increased energy and power for the ego, linked to a lost relation to God, constitutes a psychological state of inflation and or despair. Now, the collective view is that the last 500 years has been a time of great progress and advancement, and so it has. The unconscious, as indicated by myth and legend, characterized this period as the advent of Antichrist and diabolical Faustian man. The realization of man's lost and desperate condition began to dawn in the 19th century and reached major proportions in the 20th century. So it's in this historical setting that the advent of Jung occurred with his discovery of the process of individuation. So what had been going on in the collective psyche since 1500 AD, the descent of the God image into empirical man, finally reaches full individual consciousness in C.G. Jung. And that happened specifically during his confrontation with the unconscious, beginning on December 12, 1913, and lasting until 1918. This experience enabled Jung to discover empirically the collective unconscious. And it followed his realization, as he tells us in his autobiography, his realization that he had no myth. And this experience was his first step in the discovery of his new myth. And we can now realize that what happened to Jung is typical. Namely, that the discovery of a new myth, or the revitalization of an old one, requires that the individual have a direct experience of the collective unconscious. That's what will do the job. However, there is a hitch, because such experience is dangerous. It can destroy as well as heal, because it opens up the opposites, and the individual can be torn apart by the opposites unless the imagery emerges which unites them. The images of the self. And it's the discovery of those images that unite the opposites which constitute the process of individuation. Another way of putting it is individuation is the process whereby the ego encounters the self, the inner God image, and establishes a living relationship to it. And when that happens, the lost God image is rediscovered within. The word Jung uses for the inner God image is the word self, with a capital S. But this very word indicates what a highly ambiguous endeavor individuation is, because that word self reminds us of selfishness. It reminds us of self-centered narcissism. Reminds us of solipsistic megalomania. The word self is very ambiguous. It doesn't have a very good odor in contemporary usage. And our apprehension is only increased when we learn that Jung describes individuation as the continuing incarnation of God. And in talking about that, he quotes Christ saying in the 10th chapter of John, "I said you are gods." This sounds like pretty dangerous doctrine. In fact, it sounds very similar to Faust's experiment with the devil. Because here was Faust, initially a good man, who exposed himself to evil and opened himself to the experience of the opposites. So he becomes the prototype of the modern man who sets forth on that dangerous journey of individuation.